The key is to make sure that you're doing something called grounding. You don't want to deploy a chatbot willy-nilly where it's like, okay, I'm just going to throw something out there and hope it works. Welcome to Sidecar Sync, your weekly dose of innovation. If you're looking for the latest news, insights, and developments in the association world, especially those driven by artificial intelligence, you're in the right place. We cut through the noise to bring you the most relevant updates with a keen focus on how AI and other emerging technologies are shaping the future. No fluff, just facts and informed discussions. I'm Amith and Mallory, chairman of Blue Cypress, and I'm your host. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Sidecar Sync. We're excited to present another episode to you today. As usual, action-packed with all of the latest that's going on in the world of AI and innovation and how it relates to your world in associations and nonprofit. We have our normal format resuming this week. The last couple of weeks, we took a little bit of a detour from our usual three-topic emerging topics format to share with you the fundamentals of AI 1 and 2. We've gotten some awesome listener feedback on those two episodes. Really appreciate that. Please keep it coming. If you think of other topics like our fundamentals of AI part 1 and 2 that you think would be useful, we'd love to hear your input on the community, or you can hit us up over any social channel or email. Before we get going with this week's episode, let's take a moment to hear from our sponsor.
Today's sponsor is Sidecar's AI Learning Hub. The AI Learning Hub is your go-to place to sharpen your AI skills and ensure you're keeping up with the latest in the AI space. When you purchase access to the AI Learning Hub, you get a library of on-demand AI lessons that are regularly updated to reflect what's new and the latest in the AI space. You also get access to live weekly office hours with AI experts. And finally, you get to join a community of fellow AI enthusiasts who are just as excited about learning about this emerging technology as you are. You can purchase 12-month access to the AI Learning Hub for $399. And if you want to get more information on that, you can go to sidecarglobal.com/hub. Amith, I'm so excited to be back with you today. How are you?
I am doing great. I'm having a great trip to Chicago. How are you today?
I am pretty well myself. So you are in Chicago right now doing some AI executive briefings. Could you share a little bit with our listeners about what that is?
Sure. Well, part of what I try to do in the community with associations and nonprofit leaders is to meet with executive teams to provide a 1-hour briefing, which is basically a 1-hour education session where I go over the fundamentals of AI and how they apply to associations, really trying to provoke conversation amongst a leadership team, to hear concerns, to hear thoughts, and to help people just get started. So many people I talk to are just still at that, the inertia is holding them back, and they need something to help catalyze their next steps. So I offer those briefings to association leaders, and here in Chicago this week, doing a number of those, meeting with some friends in the community. So it's a great trip so far.
Awesome. I know you've just started these yesterday, I believe, but have you noticed any common threads thus far throughout your meetings?
Yes, there definitely have been some common threads, and they extend from similar meetings I've had recently over the air essentially, and the common concerns are essentially the usual things we talk about in this podcast. How do you do AI in a responsible way? How do you make sure that you're not using AI where it will not be effective? Questions like hallucinations are common. How do you deal with those issues? And of course, there's lots of ways of managing that, as we've talked about on this pod before, and that may actually be a really good topic for a future pod. Is just the hallucinations podcast. Our top 10 favorite hallucinations and how to mitigate them. But it is a common concern. It's an appropriate concern, and of course, there's ways of handling that. But that's common. And then the other things people talk about really are the intersection of their profession, whatever that is. Here in the Chicago area, there are a ton of healthcare related associations. So people in a variety of different medical specialty areas, and a number of other healthcare domains. And so, there's a lot of interesting conversations, not just about the business of associations, but the professions these associations serve. And through that conversation, how does the association assert leadership in their profession around the topic of AI? How will AI affect various different professions? It's a really important area for associations to lead, not just their internal use of AI, but how AI will affect the professions they're in.
Well, it sounds like you've had some pretty interesting meetings thus far, and will continue throughout the rest of the week. Today, as Amith mentioned, we have our regular format programmed. We have 3 topics that we want to cover. First of those will be Claude 3, the new Claude 3 family of models. Next, we'll be talking about Klarna's AI assistant. And then our last topic is one that is a little bit unusual for us, our uncharted territories, about maybe the fact that there's too much hype around generative AI right now. So stay tuned for that if you want to hear our takes on that topic. First and foremost, Claude 3. The Claude 3 model family introduces 3 advanced models named Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus, offering each a unique blend of speed, cost, and intelligence for varied applications. So I want to break down each of those really quickly for you. First, we have Haiku. This is the fastest and most cost-effective option designed for quick, simple queries and is optimized for near-instant responsiveness and customer interactions and content moderation. Next up, we have Sonnet, which balances speed and intelligence, making it suitable for enterprise-level tasks that demand rapid responses like data processing and sales automation. It's kind of the middle ground in terms of cost and performance. And then last, we have Claude 3 Opus. This is the most advanced model with the highest intelligence, capable of handling complex tasks with near-human comprehension and fluency. It's ideal for tasks requiring deep analysis, such as R&D and strategic planning, but with a higher cost. Now, the Claude 3 family of models will initially offer a 200,000 token context window upon launch, but all 3 models are capable of accepting inputs exceeding 1 million tokens. Claude 3 Opus not only achieved near perfect recall, surpassing 99% accuracy, but in some cases, it even identified limitations of the evaluation itself by recognizing the needle sentence. We've talked about this before, the needle in a haystack test, but recognizing the needle sentence in a really large context was artificially inserted into that text by a human, which I think is just really interesting to think about. Opus and Sonnet are now accessible through Claude.ai and its API, and Haiku will be released soon. So, Amith, I'm curious, first and foremost, what do you think about introducing a family of models as opposed to just focusing on your top tier model, let's say?
Sure. Well, I think that's going to be the norm going forward. And we actually already saw Google do that with Gemini when they released it back in the latter part of last year, where they released Gemini Nano, Gemini Pro, and Gemini Ultra. Very, very similar game plan. And the idea is that, you don't necessarily need the biggest tool for every job. So think of it as, the different types of things that you use to achieve a job. You pick the tool that's appropriately sized. You don't always need a power drill. Sometimes you just need like something much smaller, and you certainly don't need a jackhammer for everything. So, it depends on the job you're going after. Those probably aren't the best analogies for tools, but the point is that Nano in the Gemini family or Haiku in the Claude family are very small, very fast, and yet very, very good models. They're very similar probably to Mistral's original Mistral Tiny model, the Mistral 7B model, or Microsoft's Phi 2 model, which is spelled PHI. These are all very small models. And we've talked a lot about small models on the pod in the past across different episodes. I speak about it a lot. I'm actually in some ways more excited about small models than I am about the big ones. And the reason I like to say that is they're so inexpensive, and with open source, you can essentially run them for nearly nothing. And they're really good. I mean, they're not as good as the frontier models, the Opus models, the Gemini Ultras, the GPT-4, or soon to be GPT-5 type models. They're not that level. But there's a lot of problems we can solve where we don't need that. If you rewound in time and said, hey, we have Claude Haiku and we have Gemini Nano or Mistral Tiny, and if you went back in time 2 years and showed those capabilities, people would be blown away by how powerful they are. So we forget that, especially those of us that spend a lot of our time in this world. So I'm very excited about that. Another thing that we want to remind listeners about is that Anthropic, the company behind the Claude family, first of all, they're very well financed. They have big investments from Amazon and from others. And they are also a leader in AI safety. So they're very focused on this technique called constitutional AI, which is one of the approaches to AI safety that I think is super interesting. They've talked a lot about that over time. In fact, their Claude 2 model was actually quite widely criticized for being too safe. Many legitimate questions that were passed to it were rejected by the model. And so it made it less useful. And they very quickly responded to that. Claude 3 is still a very safe model, but has better understanding of what's reasonable and what's not. Bottom line for me is I'm excited to see continued progress. I'm not surprised one bit by this announcement. I jumped right in. I started playing with Claude 3, both in terms of their playground type environment and also in some of the development projects we have going on. And it's pretty performant and quite smart. So it's exciting to see this happen. As these models get used in real life use cases, we'll know more about their capabilities. I definitely think Claude 3 Opus is going to give GPT-4 a run for the money. In fact, in many ways, it's better than GPT-4. But GPT-4, we have to remember, is now exactly a year old. And we know that OpenAI is cooking up other stuff, and they're very good at releasing new things right after someone else has done something that seems remarkable. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see something very soon from those guys, whether it's a GPT-4.5 type release or a GPT-5. So pretty excited about that. But focusing on Claude and the 3 models, a lot of options there for building. It goes back to this idea that you have to do 2 things well with AI right now if you want to be prepared for all this change. First, so you got to just stay on top of this stuff, at least at a high level. But you also have to build with change in mind. And people are not generally good at that when they're building software infrastructure. They tend to say, hey, we're going to go and adopt the OpenAI stack. It's going to be OpenAI and LangChain and this and that. And they say, we're going to do that. And theoretically, they want to have the ability to plug in different models. But usually people don't really actually do that. And that's a big, big problem because you want to have optionality here. And there's a number of ways to approach that from a software development viewpoint, but the concept is more important even than the how you do it, which is don't plan on getting married to one of these models. Plan on having optionality.
Yeah, you've mentioned this before, the idea of a layer of insulation. Make sure you're not so dependent on a model that you can't switch it up if Anthropic or OpenAI releases something bigger and better. It sounds like the smaller models, at least what you're saying, are inexpensive and they're good at what they do, but I'm still struggling to contextualize exactly why we would want the smaller, quicker model. Like in what concrete examples would you prefer that as opposed to something more advanced?
Well, let me give you an association example. Let's say I have 100,000 documents that I want to classify quickly and apply a taxonomy against. So I could take something like Claude 3 Haiku, I could take Gemini Nano, and they're going to be perfectly good for something. That's a very simple task, actually. So that's a great, simple example. With 100,000 documents, you don't want to pay for GPT-4 level performance. You want to quickly process them. And you also want it to be inexpensive, obviously, especially if you want to redo it over and over again. So there's a lot of classification and summarization type tasks that don't require the full horsepower of the best and most powerful models. There's a lot of those types of tasks all over the place in our businesses. I think if you broke down a flowchart of a typical business process and let's say an area of your company like membership processing or certification processing, and you were to say step by step, where can AI augment and where it can automate, you would find there's a lot of steps in those processes that do not require, the full horsepower of one of these frontier models and can do quite well with a much smaller model. Also, remember the smaller models are super fast. And they can also be run locally in your own environments. And so that for really highly sensitive content, here in Chicago, talking with a lot of healthcare related associations, there's deep concerns over AI and privacy, as there should be. And I'm glad these organizations are so focused on protecting PII and healthcare data and everything else. But one of the ways to ensure that is to basically provision your own environment in the cloud and run instances of open source models. You can use an Amazon Bedrock or you can use Azure. It doesn't need to be super complicated, but you can have your own contained environment essentially. And these small models make that possible. And by the way, the Claude 3 family, as you'd expect with Amazon as their major financial backer, is available on Amazon. You can access it through AWS immediately at the same time as on their direct API.
When talking about advanced models and the exponential growth curve that we're currently on, as cost goes down and speed goes up for those more advanced models, do you see a time where all of the models kind of converge and everyone's using the most advanced model because it's cheap to run and powerful? Or do you still see there always being a place for the smaller model? as well?
I think there will be, for the foreseeable future, I would think that the models that are smaller will have a very important place. In fact, they'll do the majority of the workloads because most of the things we need to do are not that complicated, especially as the scale of AI use increases, we're going to need to get more efficient. We've talked a little bit on this podcast about this thing called the Quadratic Problem, which is a math term, but basically it has to do with the current model architectures. And the simple version of that is, as a model, as you scale the size of the model, and most importantly, the context window and what's in the context window, the time it takes and the processing that's required to deal with a bigger context is nonlinear. Meaning, so if I give you 1,000 words, that's not twice as big of a deal as 500 words. It's an order of magnitude operation bigger because it's essentially a squaring operation. It's an exponential growth curve. So 1,000 tokens actually is a pretty big deal. And if you go to 1 million tokens, it's basically 1 million times 1 million is what's going on roughly in terms of processing compared to, a linear type of expansion. There will be new models coming that solve that issue over the next few years for sure. And that might mitigate what you're describing is the need to pick different models because the bigger models may be really efficient. But I still think there will be room for lightweight, high speed, inexpensive models that are highly performant. And I think we're going to see that broadly. So it's a multi-model world that we're going to be living in. And I think that's a healthy thing because it also drives competition. If I can say, hey, I'm going to pick Mistral Tiny for certain workloads, but for my frontier capabilities, I'm going to go to Gemini Ultra because for my needs, that model maybe is the best. I'm making that up. Obviously, every organization might have a different model selection. I think it's one of the things about governance around AI that you need to think about. You don't want to be willy-nilly and just picking whatever model and just grabbing stuff and just haphazardly using these things. You want to be thoughtful about it. But I think every 6 months, every 12 months, you want to pop your head up and say, hey, are there new models we should be evaluating and considering? And for the less technical associations, you might just use a single model for the time being. But I don't think you need, especially for the types of use cases I'm hearing about, like 85, 90% of the things people want to do, you could probably do with the Haiku Nano category of model. I do want to comment briefly on the context window part that you mentioned earlier. I think, Mallory, that's probably an even more impressive part of the most recent releases we've talked about here, related to the Gemini 1.5 Pro release a couple weeks ago, and now with Claude 3. So these model families from Google and Anthropic, respectively, both have tremendous reasoning capabilities compared to prior model families. But they talk about the big context windows, the 1 million token potential. Google talks about 10 million in the lab. Those are interesting stats, but the fact that they have near perfect recall is way more important because even with the current models that we've had preceding these announcements, they've had roughly 100,000 token, capabilities, which most people don't use on every call because think about it this way, even though they can take 1 million tokens, if you sent 1 million tokens for every request to Gemini 1.5 Pro, it would cost you a fortune and it would be really slow. So you really don't need that. But what you want is with 5,000 tokens or 10,000 tokens or something like that to have perfect recall because these models are very forgetful. They're very good at remembering kind of the first thing you told them and the last thing you told them, but they forget the stuff in the middle regularly. And there's been some scientific advances across the board here with these leading families of models that make the recall far better. So your applications are going to perform better, and your use of consumer tools like ChatGPT and others will be much more pleasing because if you've ever had a long conversation with ChatGPT where it's forgotten stuff you told it maybe a few minutes ago that's higher up in the thread, that's going to go away over time because the context window is what we're talking about, right? So that long thread, pretty much all of it can be loaded up over time. That's not technically how it works right now. They do a lot of compression, but the point is it's going to be a lot less forgetful. And that will make the experience much better for pretty much all use cases. So to me, that's exciting is that near perfect recall, the fact that it identified the test needle in the haystack test problem and said, hey, this is artificially inserted data. Are you trying to fool me? It's a little bit creepy, I guess, but it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, they're getting smarter, it seems, or at least headed in that direction toward reasoning. You all have heard me talk about before that I get really frustrated with the fact that ChatGPT, for example, forgets things that I've told it in the same threads. As a small follow-up question to that, Amith, is it You've talked about the fact that it's compressing that information. Is it that it's forgetting what's in the middle, or that it never even looked at what was in the middle of a long context?
The short answer is it depends.
Okay.
So if I build an application and I'm in complete control of what I pass into the model in terms of the context window, then you have a forgetfulness problem in the sense that it does have the full context. If I pass it 100,000 tokens, it's got all those tokens. With ChatGPT and other consumer-centric tools, that's not how they work, because they're not going to take the entire conversation and pass it in every single time. It's just too expensive for them to do that. So they use natural language techniques to basically create compression of large chunks of the conversation. And that's why you're seeing forgetfulness there. Again, over time, those techniques are going to get better and better, and bigger chunks are going to get passed into the model. If we solve this quadratic problem I referred to earlier, and you said, hey, it's really not much more costly from a compute perspective to pass in the entire conversation, right? Then models will do that, because models that do that, I should say applications will do that, because applications that do that, like ChatGPT, will have way better user experiences than ones that do this compression technique. The compression technique is basically a hack that ChatGPT originally innovated in order to make it possible for you to think you were having this super long conversation. The reality is that, like, the underlying model only saw the last couple messages, probably the first couple messages, and then a highly compressed version of the middle, like a summary of the middle.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I feel like you've explained that a few times, but for whatever reason, that time just now, I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me.
The user interface is a little bit misleading, not intentionally, obviously, but it's like, it looks like you're having this long conversation. You're like, hey, you're a computer. You're not supposed to forget stuff, right? But we forget that the way these models works a little bit differently. And this is still the first inning of all this stuff. I know we're calling it GPT-4 and it's, Claude 3 and Gemini 1.5 and blah, 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 blah. But the reality is all this stuff is version 1.
That makes sense. You mentioned Gemini 1.5, and you have experimented with that. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
I have. A number of our colleagues here at the Blue Cypress family have had early access to it. We've been doing a number of experiments with Gemini 1.5 Pro, particularly with multimodal approach. So Gemini, one of its big things that kind of was not really paid attention to much in the press was that it was trained from the beginning on multimodal content, meaning it was trained on video, it was trained on audio, it was trained on a lot of stuff, not just text, which makes it the first model that is natively multimodal. In comparison, GPT-4 has multiple different pieces to it, right? Where they've assembled what feels like a multi-modality environment, but actually GPT-4 has a completely separate model for vision, and it's not connected at all to GPT-4's language model, whereas Gemini is a unified multimodal model. That's a very interesting breakthrough. So what I wanted to do was to test it to say, hey, I do a lot of speaking, and the Ascend book that we published last year needs an update. In fact, we were planning to update it in the fall, and I got real busy, and so I didn't update it in the fall, and so I'm working on it right now. And I expect, by the way, for all of our listeners who've read the book, I plan to have an update out there by early May with Ascend second edition, which will be significantly enhanced and updated with all the things that are going on. And then we do plan to update it every 6 to 9 months thereafter. But in any event, I thought Gemini might be able to help me by kind of comparing my thinking on what should be updated in the book to its thinking. And the way I did this is I took a recent executive briefing, actually. I had a recording from Zoom from one of the AI executive briefings I conducted for a large association. And I took that recording and I gave it to Gemini. It was an hour and 10 minutes or something like that. And that translates to about 800,000 tokens on that video. And then I gave it the book, which translated to, I think, maybe 70,000 tokens. So still within the million token window. I said, hey, here's a book I published last spring. And here's a recent presentation I gave. Give me an outline of what I should update in the book based on what I'm now talking about 8-9 months later that isn't included in the book. And it did a respectable job. I won't say that it's perfect. The fact that it did it at all is actually quite amazing. And I was trying to break it, because giving it the million tokens, giving it 2 modalities of content, and it's a released product, but it's still kind of beta-ish, I guess I should say. But it was a very good experience because it was able to ingest that content. It did produce some interesting ideas. For example, I spend a lot of time talking about agency or agents when I do these AI briefings. And that wasn't covered much at all in the original book. And so it highlighted that, hey, I spent a lot of time on that. You should cover it, in the next edition of the book. So I had a good experience with it. I've tested it for a few other things. Gemini 1.5 Pro does not yet have API access, even for those that are in the early access program. Hopefully that's right around the corner, and that'll help because there's a lot of things you can do by plugging in Gemini into apps like Betty and Skip, which are a couple of our AI tools. And that'll be really interesting, but we haven't been able to do that yet, which will really stress test these models against GPT-4 in a really interesting way. So more to come once we get that, but initial findings have been quite positive. I will say it was quite slow, but I expected it to be because I threw it a large chunk of content. I told it to, basically watch my video, right? It's not a transcript of the video, but actually watch the video and read my book and then come back to me with an outline. And it took about 2 minutes, I believe, 2.5 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes? I thought you were going to say like an hour. Okay, 2 minutes is very quick.
Yeah, so for me, I would say, that's horribly slow, but it's you're right, because how long would it take one of us to do that, right? It would take a while.
Exactly, starting and pausing, jotting down the notes. Very, very interesting. So more to come with us on Gemini 1.5. And Amith, did you play with that in a playground kind of area? Okay.
I did. Yeah, Google has something called the AI Studio, which anyone can access if you just go and Google the Google AI Studio. You can get access to Gemini 1.0 Pro in the playground, and I think also 1.0 Ultra in the playground. But to get 1.5, you have to be in the Google Early Access program right now. I think that'll become generally available very soon. But again, for the API access, that's what they haven't yet made available, even for those in the Early Access program for 1.5.
Well, you mentioned chatbots, which is a good segue into our next topic, where we have a company called Klarna having tons of success with their new AI chatbot assistant. Klarna introduced an AI assistant powered by OpenAI recently, and Klarna, for those of you who do not know, is a buy now, pay later service. So it allows shoppers the chance to buy items online or in physical stores without paying the whole amount up front. Their assistant offers 24/7 customer service, and it acts as a dependable resource for various queries like refunds, returns, payment issues, ensuring quick solutions. It also serves as a personal financial assistant, providing real-time updates on balances and payment schedules to help users manage their finances effectively. Additionally, the assistant offers multilingual support, communicating in over 35 languages to accommodate global users, enhancing the shopping and payments experience for Klarna's consumers. Now, let's get into the fun part. What results did they see with this AI assistant? In its first month, the AI assistant handled 2.3 million conversations, or 2/3 of their customer service chats, effectively doing the work of 700 full-time agents and matching human agents in customer satisfaction. It significantly reduced repeat inquiries by 25% and cut down resolution times as well. It is projected to improve Klarna's profits by $40 million in 2024, which is pretty insane. Amith, we talk about chatbots probably pretty frequently on this podcast and how they, one, reduce friction, but we also talk about the fact that this kind of technology will become an expectation when you start seeing it everywhere. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, the other thing about their press release was that the average response time the average resolution time went from 11 minutes to 2 minutes. So think about 9 minutes of extra time to interact with one of us versus 2 minutes to get what you need from the AI agent. And also the fact that it reduced the repeat inquiries because it actually solved the problem more conclusively. That's a great example in reducing friction. You made that customer's life so much easier. And Klarna is essentially, they do operate as a brand that consumers are aware of because they're this buy now, pay later service. But effectively, they're like a supporting piece of infrastructure for a lot of independent e-commerce brands and also stores. And so it's very important as a consumer-focused company that they're very quick at responding to issues, because many of the things they're going to respond to will result in people proceeding with the transaction versus not proceeding with the transaction. So that reduced friction is not only going to affect them in terms of reducing their costs internally, but improve customer sat, which will increase repeat use, and it'll also convert first-time users into paying customers. So it's going to have a lot of effects that are positive. The way I describe chatbots when I speak to associations is very simple. I say that chatbots up until now have been totally selfish. They're focused on reducing what we have to do in terms of our time spent helping the customer or the member. And they're really a pain historically, right? They're basically a chat version of the dreaded phone tree where you call a customer service center. You have to go through like press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 to do something really bad. It's like all these horrible options, right? I don't want to press any of those buttons. And the chatbots have historically been like a really horrible version of that. But they have saved companies money, which is why people have implemented them. But now it's flipping the script around saying, hey, this is making your customer's life better. Yes, it'll also save you money, but that's the byproduct of giving your customers something that they actually prefer. And so to your question, Mallory, about like what people are going to expect, if you don't have this stuff and they're getting it from Klarna, they're getting it from Amazon, they're getting it from Netflix, they're getting this kind of quality of customer service from everyone else, and you're not providing it, they're going to perceive you obviously as dated, but they're not going to want to do business with you. It's going to be that simple. People are going to want the easy, fast, low friction path. It really is that simple.
Mm-hmm. So based on that take, do you think a chatbot, I wouldn't call it a low-hanging fruit by any means, but do you think that's something all associations should be looking at implementing right now, or are there other factors they should consider?
No, I think every single association needs to look at this. They need to have the ability to communicate. Communication is the lifeblood of all businesses. Certainly is the case for associations. You have to communicate with your customers, your prospects, your members, your attendees, your vendors, your partners, your suppliers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to communicate with people in a way they find efficient, pleasing, and it turns out that this type of technology is also really good at saving you time and money, we'll come back to that. But if you don't put that up there, you're going to be at a big disadvantage. The good news about chat is it's actually one of the easier applications to deploy. There's a lot of ways to do it, and when you deploy chat, you don't need to have your enterprise wide data figured out. You need your content. You need to have your organization's policies, and you need to have a lot of your content ready for the chatbot to train on, because what makes these things useful is they have context. They understand your customer service policies. They understand your events. They understand your membership. They understand all of your content if you choose to train it on your content. And so that takes a moment of time to go through and properly think through how long, what content assets you should give the chatbot access to. But that's a tiny amount of work compared to enterprise data readiness for other AI applications. Like if you want to do enterprise analytics and predictive work, that's a lot bigger challenge for most groups than getting a chatbot up and running. So I think it is low-hanging fruit. Doesn't mean it's super easy. It doesn't mean it's free. There are ways to do these things fairly painlessly and at fairly low cost, but it's one of those applications you can get going in a month or two. And the other low-hanging fruit is around email and personalization, because people hate your emails until they don't. And what I mean by that is they'll hate your emails as long as they don't serve them. Once the email is actually personalized and it serves the recipient and it's useful, people start loving your emails. So email personalization, fairly straightforward to do with AI these days, as is chat. I think both of those applications are fairly straightforward to get going with.
You mentioned that hallucinations have been a common thread in your AI executive briefings, and I'm sure we have listeners right now thinking, well, I'd like to implement a chatbot, but I'm also a bit concerned about being responsible for the information it provides. And I know, Amith, I shared with you maybe a few weeks ago, I don't have the news article handy, but something about a Canadian airline. It's AI chatbot providing the wrong information about a policy, and then the courts ruled that it had to honor what the chatbot said. That's like my very general overview of what that article said. I think you mentioned that was older technology, but what do you say about the people who have concerns for that?
Those are good concerns to have. They're appropriate concerns to have. And yes, the Canadian airline example was based on an older technology. The biggest clue to that is the courts made a ruling, which never happens quickly. So it was definitely an older technology that predates a lot of what we talk about on this podcast. That being said, you could still have these types of issues with the latest new technology. It's just much less likely. The key is to make sure that you're doing something called grounding. You don't want to deploy a chatbot willy-nilly where it's like, okay, I'm just going to throw something out there and hope it works. You need to go through a process of training it on the content that you actually consider your gold standard content, and you need to then test it. You actually need to do the diligence to train it and test it. If you do that, it'll be very accurate. It'll be very good. And there's ways to address hallucinations with these private chat tools it's much less likely to happen, very, very low probability compared to like ChatGPT or these other broader use tools that cover a lot of topics. Because in your case, your chatbot's only going to address your topics, which is a very narrow subset of the world. The other thing about hallucinations that I keep reinforcing is that they do still exist with the current models we're talking about, but they got a ton of press back in the era of GPT 3.5, which was the first AI model that powered ChatGPT back in the fall of 22. And for, and even GPT-4 was pretty good at hallucinating for the first few months. But all these models have gotten way better at reducing hallucinations, verifying things, having citations, all of that. But it's important that you use a chat tool that has a very strong engineering focus on grounding and provides citations as well.
Mm-hmm. Klarna, I researched this. Klarna did about $2 billion in revenue last year, and it's projected, like I mentioned, to increase its profits by $40 million on the chatbot alone. Do you see chatbots as a way to also increase profit for associations or just cut costs? Okay. And how so?
Yeah, for sure. If you think about it, you're going to have a better customer service experience, which means you're more likely to cross-sell and upsell. If that's, if you're more than a one-trick pony in terms of having multiple products, services, and most people do, they have events, they have courses, they have other things you can sell. You'll upsell, you'll cross-sell better if you have a tool like this in place. You also have time to think about those things, right? Whereas right now, most of your staff is so busy, they probably don't have time to think about anything other than just like doing the task. But cutting the cost is definitely a big part of it. If you have an operation at the scale of a Klarna, of course, it's going to have a big effect. Associations don't typically have call centers that big. They might have 5 people, 10 people, in some cases, 50 people doing these kinds of jobs. And there's certainly opportunities to take the short-term view, which is, okay, let's cut a bunch of jobs and save money. My hope is that most associations and organizations will take a little bit longer-term view and say, well, I've been able to offload a lot of that work to automation. What can I do with my best and brightest? And that doesn't mean necessarily all of your people fall into that category, but there's a lot of really good people in these organizations that have, in some cases, years of frontline experience serving customers. You still need some of them doing that, by the way, because the AI is not so good where it solves 100% of the problems. You still need some people. But what could those people do to help you think about how to level up, right? Not just be reactive to customers, but how can we do more to provide them even more value? And a lot of executives don't bother asking their frontline troops too often, hey, what can we do to improve member engagement? What can we do to improve member satisfaction? They just kind of, talk in a boardroom, maybe get a survey from some consultant that, looked at the data. But a lot of times the people on the ground have incredible insight, but they're busy. They're just busy, chasing the actual task. And so I think the longer term view is this represents some really interesting opportunity for a lot of associations.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up. We like to keep things as real as possible on this podcast, and certainly reading this, my immediate thought is, wow, that's going to impact a lot of customer service reps who work in call centers. But I like your thought of rethinking customer service maybe, and this idea of being proactive rather than reactive. Certainly it will still impact jobs, but maybe there's a new way to think about customer service.
Yeah. And again, I'm a realist as well. If you think about, if there's 1,000 people in a call center, maybe 200 of them have a job after this stuff is deployed. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. And that actually becomes a big societal issue. I don't think it's the responsibility of an individual company to figure that out necessarily. I think the smart companies will figure out portions of that problem by saying, hey, who are my best people in there that have been displaced by this, and how can I get them involved in other things? Because they have this great knowledge base of my company and my organization. How can I engage these folks in other work? But there's going to be, customer services as category. I don't know how many millions of people worldwide are in that field. And again, not all of them are going to be displaced overnight. But in the coming, say, 5 years, I would think that 50% or more of those jobs would be displaced. So it's a big societal issue. We've got to figure out what to do.
All right, moving on to our last topic of the day, the interesting one that everyone's been waiting for. Is there too much hype around generative AI? Despite the excitement around generative AI, major cloud providers like Microsoft, AWS, and Google seem to be cautious right now. High costs, questions about accuracy, and uncertain value have led businesses to be deliberate with their AI investments. And while billions have been spent on AI infrastructure, tangible benefits and revenue growth from AI services are still emerging. At an annual AWS kickoff event for sales staff recently, an analyst from research firm Gartner discussed the generative AI hype cycle, predicting a potential trough of disillusionment due to the technology's current limitations. However, AWS is still leaning optimistic on AI, with their sales chief, Matt Garman, encouraging the team to increase their knowledge of generative AI and actively engage with customers about AWS's services. But despite those ambitions, AWS CEO Andy Jassy has indicated that, as of now, generative AI contributes relatively modestly to AWS's revenue, but has high expectations for the future. Ali Ghodsi, CEO of Databricks, highlights how generative AI is being leveraged more for comprehension and analysis rather than content creation. He says firms in sectors like insurance and finance are using these models to efficiently process and summarize large volumes of textual data, kind of like you did, Amith, with your example with Gemini 1.5, like SEC filings, for example. But this application mainly aims at cost reduction through internal process optimization, showing an early practical use of generative AI that diverges from its expected role, maybe to accelerate sales and growth, for example. Amith, really curious to get your take on this. Are we in a trough of disillusionment? Is the hype around AI surpassing its capabilities currently?
It's a great question. The short version of my answer is I don't know, because so much is changing so quickly. I don't think that's fair or reasonable for any individual to claim they know the answer to that. I think the probability of a so-called trough of disillusionment is entirely possible perhaps this year, because the expectations are sky high and there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think that the people who are out there trying to educate on what AI's current capabilities are, what's likely to happen in the near future, and how to deploy it to gain benefit are doing a good job doing that broadly, not just in this market. But there's a lot of people out there who are saying, is AI sentient? Is AI capable of true reasoning? And the short answer is none of that stuff is true yet, or maybe it never will be, right? So I think there's a lot of categories where AI is poor to zero in terms of its abilities. We've talked in this podcast about reasoning. We've talked about planning. We've talked about, different capabilities. Language models are not capable of any form of planning, and any really complex work is going to require planning. And so I think you have to look at it and say, well, but the thing is that it's a little bit misleading, like in terms of the way you use the technology, because when you go talk to GPT-4 or you go talk to Claude 3, it feels like you're talking to an intelligent agent, because these things have mastered language. They haven't yet mastered logic. They haven't yet mastered truly, being able to do reasoning, planning, execution through tasks, all that stuff. So because these things seem really, really smart, and they are in a lot of ways, people assume they're smart in every way. And so that could lead to an expectations bubble. So that could be where I think this trough of disillusionment possibility is there. So, if you think you're going to automate everything, or if you think that the AI can literally plug in and do, all sorts of things that require, complex planning, you're going to be disappointed with the current models. You can't do that yet. But it doesn't mean you can't do unbelievable stuff with what we have today. The way I like to describe this to people, independent of this particular article, but it's more about the kind of general idea, is imagine this scenario. Let's hypothesize that AI research stops. Somehow globally, zero work is done on advancing the science of artificial intelligence. So we don't have any new models coming out. But what we do have is engineering capability, meaning outside of the science of inventing new models and new algorithms, we have the ability to essentially construct solutions from the models we already have. So I would say that in that scenario where we receive no additional improvements to AI models at all, it would probably take at least 5 years, maybe more like 10 to 15, to really benefit from just the capability that we have of advanced language understanding. Because in the last couple of years, we have really, the AI models that we currently have, and this is even a generation ago, have solved language in the sense that the models are better at language understanding and reading comprehension than the average person is. And so, we have not deployed any of that in business or in society at scale. So even if there was no advancement whatsoever in the models, there's a lot of value to be gained. I think the disillusionment is going to come from people who have really the incorrect expectations, which can come from, reasonable, people trying to have reasonable conversations. But that's why education is so important, because you can't really understand these models just by listening to what the press is saying about them. You have to get some hands-on experience. And then you'll understand there's some significant limitations of the models that we have today. I am optimistic, by the way, that the research progress is going to be incredible and keep going and probably accelerate somewhat from where we are at now. But I'm just saying that if you hypothesize that there is no progress, you still would have massive gains to be had from the models that we already have in our hands.
Mm-hmm. I think the interesting distinction here is progress, like you mentioned, from cutting costs or actually increasing revenue. And I'm wondering if at this point you think that if you're surprised by that, one, but then two, do you think that's because of the technology itself or because of how we humans are using the technology?
Well, whenever you have a new tool, you don't know how you're going to use it. General purpose technology is initially viewed typically as a novel, but perhaps fringe thing. Even something like electricity is not necessarily looked at as a world-changing thing that's going to be in every nook and cranny of the world. Initially, it's looked at from an industrial perspective. How can we replace steam engines with electric motors in factories? And then, going to the home might be like a secondary or tertiary thing. Then mobility, obviously, that electricity enables at scale, not even considered, right? So when you have a general purpose technology, it takes time to weave it in to all of these different places where it can create value. And so when you think about it that way, you say, okay, well, how long will AI take to weave itself in? It's going to take a while. There's going to be a lot of gains in a lot of fields where these fundamental building blocks that we did not have up until recently get taken advantage of. So I do think there's going to be hype cycles. I think there's going to be ups and downs. There's going to be some big project wins in the world. There's going to be some major and spectacular failures. And I think what you have to do is be pragmatic. You have to look at the easy wins. I don't try to coach association CEOs to go after the grand prize right away. I always tell them pick something small, experiment with it. So like with chatbots, for example, if you're uncomfortable with a chatbot that actually talks to your professional members about their domain of knowledge, then don't start there. Focus on the business of the association first, things like membership and events and the stuff that's a lot lower stakes, and then move on to higher stakes things. I think these tools can do a great job, by the way, with the domain content, but that's not the point. It's about how you feel about it. It's not about taking big swings. It's about taking small swings, just taking a lot of them. So I think it comes back to being reasonable, looking at it from the perspective of taking it one step at a time and finding business value for you. Because think about it this way, Mallory. If in our business for Sidecar, we deployed an AI tool that could make your content better for your reader, and objectively speaking, you had higher NPS or better subscriber growth or more people in the Learning Hub or whatever the metric is you care about as the leader of Sidecar, independent of what the world thinks of AI, you've objectively improved your business. You've maybe increased revenue, you've probably increased customer sat, maybe you've reduced your costs somewhat. So it doesn't really matter what the hype cycle says if the tangible benefits are there. So I tend to be one of these people who is comfortable ignoring hype cycles for the most part, but they are relevant to look at because they influence the world. They influence the way your members think. They influence the way your board thinks and how you get funding for these projects. So it's a super relevant topic. But again, I think I would just focus on pragmatic step-by-step adoption that is focused on tangible business outcomes that are provable, where you can say, like, you can't dispute that Klarna has made major progress. Like, even if nothing else changes for the next 10 years for them, they have a way better business and their customers are happier as a result of this tech.
Mm-hmm. I think with your example with Sidecar, I totally agree with you. I think we've made leaps and strides using AI tools. I think what can be difficult for us and probably for a lot of association leaders listening to this podcast is measuring that success. And I think when you hear something like AWS is seeing little impact on its revenue from AI, a smaller organization like an association might say, well, we're a little bit afraid to invest money in this if we're not going to see an immediate impact. So what do you say about that, about measuring your success? I know you talked about easy wins, but any thoughts around that?
Well, the bigger the prize, the more you have to invest ahead of revenue. And so, AI for the major companies, it's super capital intensive, and you're going after, $100 trillion prize potentially in terms of the revenue potential of this industry at scale, or possibly much bigger than that. I mean, that sounds like an absurd thing for me to say, because that's approximately equivalent to global GDP. But the opportunity there in the next few decades to build the AI space is just absolutely enormous. So that's why everyone's pouring so much capital into it. But Amazon doesn't expect to have a lot of revenue in early 2024 from it. They are not thinking about that. I mean, it's like an interesting data point, but it's not super relevant. The other thing to remember is revenue is a trailing indicator. It's not a leading indicator of what you're doing strategically. And so it doesn't mean that it never matters. Of course it matters. But think about the iPhone and how long that thing took to become a major revenue stream for Apple, right? Or think about, even OpenAI's experience. They're $1 billion plus in annual run rate now, and they're growing really fast. But they're actually probably the biggest consumer-oriented revenue story in the AI world still. But the infrastructure players like Amazon, they're going to take some time to get there in terms of usage, because basically the way all this AI stuff works is you invest billions of dollars in data centers and in training models and getting all that stuff up and running. And that's the capital you put into building it. And then your hope is that, your thing is cooler than the next person's thing. And so you then hope people start using your service. And it's kind of like, using a metered phone line, where the more calls that are made through your network or your AI system, basically, the more money you make. So that's why it's hyper competitive, because of the potential size of the opportunity. But I wouldn't even pay attention to the revenue metrics for these major companies yet. I'd look at them, but I don't think that they're the key thing to look at. The other thing to remember about exponential growth is, things look like 0 until they look like 1, and then they start looking like a much bigger number really quickly. So yeah, I mean, AI revenue to Amazon is a rounding error right now. It's irrelevant, but it won't be for long. It'll become significant to them very soon.
Mm-hmm. I think it'd be interesting for us to do, maybe not a whole episode, but like a topic around easy wins, like you mentioned. We talked about chatbots. We've definitely talked about the role that an AI application could play in like the speaker proposal process. Are there any others that come to mind in terms of easier wins that you could go after?
Well, one of my favorite things is when you're training people to use these AI tools is to kind of flip the process around. A lot of people say, hey, I'm going to have the AI do my writing for me, which it can do. But what about the opposite side of take existing content you have and say, hey, AI, help me make this better? And AI is actually extraordinarily good at being an editor. And a lot of people who are uncomfortable with using AI for writing for various reasons could certainly use it that way. So I think there's some use cases like that people haven't thought of, or some people obviously have, but they're not used at scale. So, what ends up happening with any new adoption or any new technologies that's being adopted is the most obvious use case is the one people talk about. So like with AI, I was like, oh, well, marketers can have it automatically generate blog posts. Cool. But there's, 1,000 other examples of things you can do with it. And AI can be a really good brainstorming partner too. I go to AI all the time and say, hey, I want to work on this piece of content, and I want to think about the topics I should be including, and help me research this, and stuff like that. So I think part of the easy wins are still the consumer grade examples. And frankly, we're a broken record to some extent on this podcast, but just getting going with your learning. We obviously have a lot of free resources on Sidecar. There's the Learning Hub. There's a lot of tools you have access to. There's a lot of places where you can get free and inexpensive tools to learn AI. That to me is the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy win, because as you people all have knowledge and experiences that are distinct from one another. And if they learn AI, it enables them to be creative and think of those easy wins for their business, for their part of the business.
Mm-hmm. And also sounding like a broken record, I know we've talked about content repurposing with tools like Munch or Opus clips. And I would say that has been an easy win for us recently, just seeing a boost in engagement on LinkedIn. We're posting clips to TikTok now, to Instagram, with very little effort on the front end. So I would highly recommend checking that out as well as an easy win.
Definitely. And then, of course, language translation stuff we've talked about here, embracing a broader audience, a different audience than we might have access to, I think is something to experiment with. If you're an American-based association and you've thought, hey, I'd love to have let's say your industry or profession has a big professional sector in, say, pick a country, Japan, but you have no presence there, you have no content there. What if you experimented with that and had an AI channel around some of your content to build an audience in a place where you have no presence, right? That historically would have cost a tremendous amount of money and time. Now you can do that in a nearly automated basis. And again, you can test it before you go full bore with it.
Yep. I think a fun question to end this episode on would be, so Amith, you have obviously tested out GPT-4, you've tested out Opus, right? And then Gemini 1.5. That's correct.
Yep.
If you right now, or when you next decide, I really want to summarize this text or do something, what tool are you going to right now?
Well, like everyone, I'm a creature of habit to some degree, even though I'm curious about all these models. I bounce around amongst them, but my workhorse is still ChatGPT, perhaps because I know it best. I use Copilot some, which is ChatGPT powered under the hood. That can be very helpful when you're in a Word document or in a PowerPoint slide to do individual things. But ChatGPT to me is the workhorse. I am experimenting more and more with Google stuff, experimenting more and more with Anthropic's now with their Claude 3 family. But, for me, it's still ChatGPT. But, I think that it's going to vary by user. This is also where there's some degree of, as you think about the maturity of these tools, enterprise adoption, where I think OpenAI is still, a long ways ahead of everyone else is, team-based and enterprise-based structure. So in ChatGPT, we have a team for our family of companies, so we can invite people there. We can have private custom GPTs that we train on chunks of content. We can do a lot of resource sharing. So they've made a smart play there to do what in the SaaS industry, we call it product-led growth, or where you have essentially a small number of users come in, they find utility in the product, and then they start sharing it with their colleagues. And that, of course, results in more people being added to the license that you pay. And they have some really good tools. That's not even about the AI. That's just a product strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I would say same for me. Probably ChatGPT for now, but I am definitely looking forward to testing out these new models and seeing if I can incorporate them more efficiently into my workflow. Amith, good luck with the rest of your executive briefings. I look forward to hearing about them.
Thanks, Mallory.
All right.
Thanks for tuning into Sidecar Sync this week. Looking to dive deeper? Download your free copy of our new book, Ascend, Unlocking the Power of AI for Associations at ascendbook.org. It's packed with insights to power your association's journey with AI. And remember, Sidecar is here with more resources from webinars to boot camps to help you stay ahead in the association world. We'll catch you in the next episode. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep disrupting.